Hi, I'm Chris Wolfe, President of the American Public Philosophy Institute, and we're delighted to have with us today Jennifer Roback Morse, who is President of the Ruth Institute and a great defender of marriage and our culture. And so I've asked her to talk a little bit about her background, especially how she got interested in questions of marriage and family and the kinds of activities she does to promote them today.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on. This will be fun.
It's great to have you, Jennifer.
Yeah. So my doctorate's actually in economics, which is not really a family-oriented topic particularly. But I got interested in the family when we started our own family. My husband and I encountered an infertility crisis that lasted over 4 years. And we resolved that infertility crisis by adopting a little boy from a Romanian orphanage. He was 2.5 years old when we got him. And then 6 months later, as God would choose, we gave birth to a little girl. Okay, so we had 2 children within 6 months' time, one of whom came into our family in the usual way, and one of whom came into our family after 2.5 years of profound neglect. And so what that experience showed us, my husband and I, is that children really do need their parents, right? And that what mothers and fathers do in the first year of life is amazing. It's amazing what you're doing. You don't even realize what you're doing.
And we take it for granted.
We take it for granted,
Yeah.
you know, and until you see somebody who's been deprived of it, you don't realize all that's involved. So that experience is what got me interested in the subject of the family, and mainly what we saw is that what we were mostly worried about was the issue of attachment, of whether our little boy would ever really attach to us and whether he would care about us and whether we would matter enough to him that when we said don't do something, that he would not do it because he didn't want us to be mad at him. You know, that's the normal way that children develop a moral compass. You know, you don't sit down and recite the 10 Commandments to a 2-year-old, you know, that doesn't work. They care that you're upset with them so that when you tell them don't do that, they don't do it, you know, because they don't want mommy and daddy to be mad at them. And sooner or later, you don't even have to tell them. You could just kind of give them the stink eye from across the room and they do it, you know. Yeah. And that's what you want. You want that moral sense to be internalized. That's what allows you to have a free society. That's what allows people to go about their business and not bother other people too much. You know, that's just the most basic thing. And we take that for granted. So a child who has no parents and they never attach to anybody, they're at risk for never having that kind of conscience and that kind of internal moral sense. And if they don't have it, it's very hard to install it later. You know, it's not like an app that you can just download and it's all going to be good. You know, so as we were dealing with that and realizing that and everything, it just became clear to me that society has been throwing away a lot of institutional structures, a lot of kind of folk wisdom that we really need.
So that led to Love and Economics, right?
And that's what led to my first book, Love and Economics. My first book was really about attachment, and it was about motherhood, you know, and it was about why you cannot have a free society without moms and dads doing their thing. It might seem like, well, we're more free because we get to do whatever we want, but the next generation is going to be a whole lot less free. So you just start to see that society depends on mom and dad getting the job done. Because if mom and dad don't get it done, number one, it can't really be done by anybody else very well. It's a lot harder to do it after the fact. And we think, when I was coming along in my young adulthood, and probably, you know, we're about the same age, you'll remember this, we all had the idea that we're going to be more free if we don't have all these family responsibilities and we can, you know, just do whatever we want sexually and with relationships and stuff like that. We're going to be free. It's going to be great. But you don't realize that freedom is one generation long, because the next generation, nobody's been there for the kids. The kids are going to come unhinged or never get hinged in the first place, you know, and they're going to require more and more social stuff around them just to maintain them, just to keep them out of trouble. And so I wrote Love and Economics in 2001. I was trying to get the economists, my economist colleagues, to pay attention to it. Complete flop in that regard. You know, most of the economists had no idea what I was talking about, didn't care about it.
Modern economics tends to start with, you know, 21-year-old adults that kind of come out of nowhere and they have preferences, and now we're going to try to see what we can do to maximize the preferences.
That's right.
But how they actually got there and how those preferences were formed. I mean, there obviously are some economists who pay attention to that, but not as much.
But on the whole, it is as you say. You assume that people are born as rational adults. They all have bank accounts and citizenship papers, and they can talk, and things like that. And where those people come from, we're not too attentive to that. And even the part of economics that was dealing with the family wasn't really dealing with child development. The child was seen kind of as a consumer good that the parents had preferences for, and so most of the studying was about the adults. And what do the adults want, and how many children do they decide to have, and who stays home to take care of the child, and how do women's wages affect it. And so it was all about the adults, not really about how you get this little bundle of impulses, which is basically what a baby is, right? Selfishness and impulses and bodily functions and stuff. How do you get them from there to the point where they can have a bank account and citizenship papers and all of that? No one knows. That's
marriages.
And not to mention that you want them to be competent to raise a generation themselves. And so what I found, Chris, and when I wrote that book, and it was published by Spence Publishing back in the day, they got me in front of a lot of radio shows with a group of people I didn't really know very much about. So I did a lot of Christian radio, evangelical radio stations. I became very involved with that community, in addition to a lot of Catholic radio and Catholic fan base, that I have. But among economists, the only people who really got it were people who already had some faith. They had some kind of faith practice, some kind of faith tradition, and it didn't much matter what it was, whether they were Catholic or Protestant or Mormon or Jewish. If they were serious about their faith, they were like, this is important, and they could get it. But if they were, garden variety, libertarian, free market economists, no clue. No clue. And what I've seen since 2001 is that process of kids not being properly socialized has gotten worse generationally. So now we have school shootings. And when you look at the school shooters, very large percentage of them are from fatherless homes or have some kind of family breakdown in their past. And, I look at it, of course, I'm not surprised that that's what's happened. But other people are all like, well, why is this happening? I'm like, well, it should. It takes some effort to develop a person into a moral being, a truly moral being, and you need your mom and your dad as part of that. So that's how I got interested in it, and that my interests have partly branched out organically, but partly I've been dragged kicking and screaming into some areas because they needed to be addressed. And
well, you moved to California, and then you got involved in the Ruth Institute?
Well, I founded the Ruth Institute in 2008, yes. And when I founded it, my children were in their teens and, kind of moving along, right? And we had been foster parents for a few years, so we had that whole experience of, dealing with some pretty disturbed kids in some cases, and some serious forms of family breakdown and everything. And my kids are doing fine now, by the way. Just want everybody to know, since I'm, talking. My son is now 30 years old, and he's fine, so don't worry about him. But at the time that I started the Ruth Institute, what I thought I was going to do is I thought I was going to be talking to college students about why they could go ahead and get married and start their families and not freak out over getting on that career path and staying there until doomsday, basically. Right. That's what I thought I was going to talk about. But that's not how it turned out, because also in 2008, in San Diego, that was the year that Proposition 8 came about. Right. And I got recruited to be involved as part of the Proposition 8 campaign.
And Proposition 8's basically this initiative in California to define marriage as between one man, one woman.
That's correct. It was a constitutional amendment to the state constitution of California saying that marriage shall be the union of one man and one woman. And that came about because there was a court case going through this California Supreme Court and so on. And so people looked at that and said, we need to get ahead of this thing and be proactive. Let's use the initiative process, which is created by the progressives of California at the
Right.
turn of the 20th century, so that, you know, citizens could, by golly, be involved in the process. And so that's what people did. And I would have preferred not to be involved in that, but I felt that I couldn't sit it out because by this time, by 2008, I had a lot of information, social science information about how much children need their own mother and their own father, and what the risks are, what the problems are. You know, I had written about single parenthood and, you know, divorce and daycare. You know, those were the issues I was worried about. But I could see that if you take the step of redefining marriage to be a genderless institution, so that, you know, you can have two parents of any gender, that means one of your parents is not there, right? It has to mean that. So I could see if you redefine marriage, you're going to redefine parenthood, and that would not be a good thing. So I got involved because I felt I couldn't sit it out. And so that's...
You were a busy woman.
Yes, that's right. So then I've been involved, so to speak, in that whole set of issues ever since then.
Yeah.
But
of course, you were successful in California.
We were.
You know, and of course then, as often happens, as many people know, I teach constitutional law, and so sometimes federal judges will simply intervene on the basis of elite preferences to overrule the will of the people. Right. And that's what happened in California.
That's exactly what happened. And it was very clear how elitist the thing was. And I can give you the details. I mean, the campaign itself was about, the spending was about equal on both sides. It was about 40 million per side on yes on Prop 8 and no on Prop 8. But the proponents of man-woman marriage had far more small contributions. In fact, it was when we went to upload our report to the Secretary of State, because you have to report all your donors and everything, you know, we crashed the computer. Seriously, there were so many individual contributors to that thing. Whereas on the other side, there was a handful of large contributors. And then when the court case came about, and by the way, we had 100,000 volunteers. 100,000 volunteers. In California, you know. So then when the court case came up, there's not much you can do with the grassroots effort, right? You don't need volunteer. What are the volunteers going to do, you know? So that part of the thing kind of went away, and it was now, you know, our lawyers versus their lawyers. Well, their legal team was financed by Rob Reiner and a bunch of Hollywood elite people, you know, who put big bucks down on their side. And on our side, it was like, can we transport our witnesses to the courtroom safely? You know, I mean, it was a huge mismatch. Yeah. And so that, seeing that, and, you know, and of course they prevailed. They prevailed on the judges. So seeing that whole process, that is part of what led me to write the book that I just came out with, which is called The Sexual State. And it's really about how the state has been instrumental in creating the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution is not a grassroots movement, even though it affects every single person. That's not what it's about. It was started by, just like this whole issue over gay marriage, it started by people at the top with lots of money, power, and influence, and imposed on people, ordinary people who didn't want it. Even in California, the ordinary people didn't want it, right? And then you start to look into the history of the thing, and you can see that that's a pattern that happened in other phases of the sexual revolution also. And so that's why I call the book The Sexual State, because without the state, we wouldn't have what we have today. We wouldn't have this kind of toxic, pornified culture that we're all living in, where family breakdown is considered normal. And what's a family is considered like, well, yeah, who knows, who cares what a family is. That simply would not be there without the power of the state enacting certain things, pressuring for certain things, financing certain things. It just wouldn't be happening, Chris.
So what are some of the issues you take up in the book, or some of the different phases of the sexual revolution?
Well, the sexual revolution, I define it as having three interlocking ideologies, all right? And one of them is the gender ideology, which is part of the whole issue. All the issues related to homosexuality are part of that. But the gender ideology is basically saying that the sex of the body is not particularly important. And so if you see differences between men and women, that's evidence of injustice, and we need to wipe that out. And that has morphed into the point where if I think I'm not a woman, I can do some things to make myself not a woman and become a man. So that the thing that links the old school original feminism with the new school transgenderism, the thing that's connecting that is the idea that the body's not really very significant. You know.
But the irony with the transgender movement is that in some ways, it depends on stereotypes. Because when somebody says, "I feel like a woman," what do they mean by woman? And it's like all the stereotypes. I like to play with dolls.
I know. And some of the images of Bruce Jenner. When I do a talk about this subject, and by the way, if people are interested, I have 45-minute talks on each one of these three ideologies I'm talking about. But you look at these images of Bruce Jenner, and his idea of what it means to be a woman is so stereotypical. You put these images up on the screen, and I'll look at my live audience and say, "You guys, I don't dress like that. No woman in this room is dressed like that. Bruce, what are you thinking?"
So gender ideology is the first part, and
then another one is the idea that a good and decent society should do everything possible to separate sex from babies. And I call that the contraceptive ideology. And I spend quite a bit of time on the contraceptive ideology because I think it's foundational. And it's so crazy. It's not just that we have contraception legally available. That has never been enough for the true ideologue, right? Contraception has to be not only legally available, it has to be free, it has to be actively promoted by the government, and the side effects of it have to be suppressed, because what we're really after is not just people's freedom to use it if they want to. What we're really after is a world where sex is a sterile activity and everybody acts on that basis. And if you have quirky lifestyle preferences like you and your wife, then you can have sex and have a baby, But basically, sex is meant to be a sterile activity. Build the whole society around that idea. That's the contraceptive ideology. And trust me, normal people did not think that up. Okay, I mean, that was not something that, Joe Sixpack thought of. Now, once you present it to the average person, a lot of them go, "Oh yeah, that sounds like fun." But you start to think it through a little further, you go, maybe not. There's some problems here that we haven't
As we were talking about earlier, it seems to me that perhaps the single most important social fact of the 20th century was, in fact, the coming of the widespread availability of contraception, which meant that sex now ended up being an autonomous activity.
Right.
In some ways, traditionally, before that, there was always this connection between sex and children, and that had a tremendous impact on the nature of sex because it had some kind of purpose beyond it. And of course, now, sex becomes a kind of end in itself in some ways.
And it was understood to be a social act. So even, yes, you have sex in private. Yes, no, the government's not involved. That's right. That's all true. But it's a deeply social act because it bonds the husband and the wife to each other. So you're building up the community of the family in that way, but it also produces more people. And you want to be connected to those people, and you want mom and dad to be connected to each other so those little babies can be connected to their mommy and their daddy at the same time without having to get on an airplane and go across the country to see the absent parent or whatever. Which brings me to the third ideology, which I call the divorce ideology. And the divorce ideology is that a good society should separate sex and babies from marriage. That marriage is just not very important. Marriage is just a piece of paper, and we can couple and recouple and break up and reconfigure ourselves. It'll be fine. That was all superstition, thinking that it wasn't fine. The kids are resilient. We and only we have figured out that children are so resilient that it won't matter what the adults do. And that is probably the most immediately harmful ideology, because I mean, I can tell you, and when I give a talk tonight, I'll be doing a talk at the University of Dallas tonight, and I'll look in that audience, you will look around that audience when I say those words, kids need their parents, and divorce is harmful to children. You will see reactions in the audience, because even at a school like University of Dallas, which is very traditionally Catholic, there are kids who have already been through 2 or 3 divorces by the time they get to college.
I had an experience like that this summer. We did a seminar on natural law in the American political tradition and for a week, and had a number of students from around the country. And we, at one point we talked a bit about marriage, and one of the students came up afterwards and kind of mentioned, clearly deeply moved, what an awful experience it had been for her to have the father leave the family.
Yes.
And that so many people can kind of buy into this ideology that kids are resilient, and it really doesn't affect them that much. They kind of there's an initial shock and then they bounce back. I mean, of course people are resilient. Of course people can make a good life out of almost any circumstances, but to somehow ignore or deny the reality of the pain that divorce causes, it's extraordinary. It shows that, the human capacity to rationalize is extraordinary.
Yeah, that's very true. And one of the things that you hear from adult children of divorce is that divorce is the gift that keeps on giving, because it doesn't go away. So when the adult child of divorce gets married and they have children themselves, who are they supposed to go visit at Christmas time? Do they visit mom and her new husband? Do they visit dad and his new wife? Who gets the seat of honor at family events? Is the family ever all together? There are continual landmines that people have to be negotiating all the time to keep from upsetting all of the potential hurt feelings that are out there. And so the continuation of what you're saying, the kind of the initial thought process that says, oh, kids are resilient, it'll be fine, that's a kind of turning inward on the self, where the mother and father, instead of thinking about the kids, the mother and father are thinking about themselves and what they want. And if they keep doing that, it gets worse. It doesn't get better, right? I mean, sometimes adults will get it and they'll go, what have I done? And I hear that all the time. What have I done? And that's a beautiful thing when there's repentance and genuine compassion, for the harm that they may have caused. But all too often, they continue the rationalization process that you're talking about, and then it gets worse and worse and crazier and crazier.
One of the striking things about Judith Wallerstein's groundbreaking work in the 80s, she went in there thinking, well, the effects of divorce are probably exaggerated or whatever, and she was shocked to find out how deep the effects were, and especially on adult children. She hadn't anticipated that at all.
Yes.
So it had a...
Yes, and the thing that's remarkable about her work is that she followed the same group of people for 25 years. And what she found, the phrase she uses, Chris, is she says, the effects crescendo in young adulthood. It's not, they don't fade away, they crescendo when the young person is trying to form their own relationships, right? All of the insecurities and the fears and the lack of trust and the lack of a role model, what am I supposed to do now, kind of thing. All of that comes together when the young adult is trying to form their own families. And I hear this all the time. One of my economist friends who got Love and Economics, he told me that he really appreciated what I had said, because he said, I've been married now 13 years, and I have been married longer than anyone in my family.
Wow.
And he's like, I'm on uncharted waters to be married that long.
I remember my daughter coming back, she went to a very fine secular school, small liberal arts college, and she described her friends as just kind of assuming that divorce was part of the landscape, that they came from families of divorce, and they kind of expected that there was a decent chance that would be part of their lives as well. Right. And it's a very different world from
That's right. And so what that does, that very point means that they're planning for impermanence. So therefore you make a different set of plans than if you're planning for permanence. So a young woman, for example, going into that situation, thinking, well, the guy he could dump me, or I could get fed up, or whatever. We might break up. Therefore, I need to be prepared now and at all times to possibly be a single mother. So I need to invest in my career. I'm not going to invest in his career. I mean, what the heck? He could walk out any minute, Well, that used to be a thing in American life, that the wife would put the husband through law school or put the husband through med school. Then they would have children together. Now, then, after the children were grown, she would have different kinds of professional or volunteer activities, or things that were important to her. The tide would turn, and she would be able to, be chairman of this or that, and do significant things that were meaningful to her. But if you don't believe the guy is going to be there past year 6, you're not going to do it. None of that inside the family cooperation, none of that's going to happen. And instead of cooperation inside the family, you're going to have commercialization, professionalization. You're going to substitute monetary things, commercial transactions, for things that could be taking place inside the family. And then we wonder why we're all lonely, and mistrustful and things like that.
So what is the Ruth Institute up these days?
Oh, my goodness. Well, the Ruth Institute produces a number of things to equip people to defend the family. I would say that's really our mission, is that we equip people, specifically Christians of all stripes, to defend the family and to explain why they believe what they believe. And a lot of times people need to know why they believe what they believe to get themselves through the hurdles of their own personal life, right? Because things happen, right? And if you don't have it clear up here, you'll just kind of roll. You can easily be rolled with the punches, But then we also need to be defending the family and defending marriage in the public square. And so we produce a variety of things to help people do that. So we have a weekly newsletter, which we invite everybody to sign up for. If you read that every week, you'll be very well informed.
And this is at www.ruthinstitute.org.
That's correct, ruthinstitute.org. And we have a very active Facebook page where we put news stories, and then we comment briefly on them, and people chat back and forth, as people do on Facebook. So those are kind of basic programs anyone can be involved with. We also promote the idea that people should be involved in personal study. So if you have a Bible study or a prayer group or something like that, we strongly recommend that as part of that process that you read something once a week and you talk about it amongst yourself. And you can use our stuff to do that. You can use anything you want, of course, but we try to make it easy for people to do that because we've simply got to be better informed. So that we call that the book club program, but it's a simple enough concept. And then we put on events. I do events for other people. I go and I'm the keynote speaker or whatever at different things, and we have that on our podcast page. But we're putting on events in our home base of Lake Charles, Louisiana. We'll be putting on something in the spring, and right now it's September of 2018 for anybody who's watching this video anytime, we are the local organizers for a big prayer rally in Lake Charles. We call it Rosary Around the Lake, and it's part of the Rosary Coast to Coast movement that is taking place on October 7th. And the reason we're doing that is that, while we're principally an academic, scientific kind of organization, we also think that it's very important that we implore divine assistance because we're not stupid, okay? I mean, we're just not going to get anywhere if all we have is ourselves at this point, situations sufficiently desperate that people should realize that. And I unapologetically recommend that people pray for the family.
Well, it's wonderful having the Ruth Institute. We need so many things like that to defend marriage and the family today. We're very fortunate to have had Jennifer Roback Morse here today talking about the work she's done in marriage and the family. Again, I'm Christopher Wolfe, president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. You'll be able to see this interview at www.appii.org. So thanks very much. We'll look forward to seeing you some other time.